kPa rules. Using kilopascals for blood gas calculations. If you read the medical or critical care literature or look at definitions or guidelines that emanate from transnational organizations, you will usually note that blood gases and blood gas calculations are provided in millimeters of mercury. That's great if you live in the parts of the world that routinely use millimeters of mercury, but I currently live in the Système International land. Those SI units that we accepted back in the 1970s include the measurement of pressure in kilopascals, so I thought it would be useful to look at kilopascals and measurement of, in particular, oxygenation. I think in many ways kilopascals for oxygen is much easier to use than millimeters of mercury. Watch the video and see why. This time I will discuss the relationship between FiO2 in percentage terms and kilopascals, oxygen content of blood in kilopascals, and the PaO2 divided by the FiO2 ratio in kilopascals. Let's start with a clinical scenario. I walk into the recovery room and Kevin, one of my patients, he's 42 years old and he's 30 minutes post-op. Kevin had lower limb surgery under general anesthesia that was supplemented by a nerve block. He received no opioids in the operating room and was brought back to the recovery room without any pain. Currently, 30 minutes later, Kevin is receiving 40% oxygen through a Venturi mask. His saturation is 99%. I ponder, why is he getting so much oxygen, and what is his likely PaO2 in kilopascals? Well, let's start with a question. What is a kilopascal? The Pascal was named after Blaise Pascal, who lived in the 17th century, a French scientist, and Blaise Pascal did not define this particular parameter, but it was adopted in 1971 as part of the SI system to standardize scientific measurements, and this was taken on by large swathes of the world, particularly in Western Europe. 1 Pascal is the vertical pressure applied by 1 Newton per meter squared, which is equal to 1 kilogram per meter per second squared. Kilopascals are mostly used in medicine and engineering. That's 1,000 pascals because a Pascal is just such a small number. Hectopascals are used in meteorology. To understand anything about gases, you must understand Dalton's law, and Dalton's law states that the total pressure exerted by a mixture of non-reactive gases, that's gases that don't react with each other, is equal to the sum of the partial pressure of the individual gases. That means if you measure all the gases, each one of them will apply a certain proportion of all the pressure. At sea level, where I live, the atmospheric pressure is around 101.3 kilopascals, or 1 atmosphere, and that is made up of nitrogen, 78%, oxygen, just under 21%, water vapor, a bit of argon, so CO2, etc. But if you really look at this carefully, you will figure out that oxygen and nitrogen contribute about 100 kilopascals between them, and the inspired oxygen, FiO2, is always 21% of the air that you breathe in, no matter whether you're at sea level or up at the top of Mount Everest. The partial pressure is determined by the atmospheric pressure locally. Therefore, here where I live, the inspired oxygen in kilopascals is approximately 21 kilopascals at sea level. Isn't that really simple? 21% of 100 is 21 kilopascals. Gases dissolve in liquids. The amount of gas that dissolves was described 200 years ago by William Henry, and it's determined by the temperature and the pressure. The higher the pressure, the more oxygen that dissolves in the liquid. In the body, that means that the total quantity of oxygen in blood is proportional to the partial pressure, the PaO2, and in this way, PaO2 is useful on blood gases. Now remember, most of the oxygen is carried associated with hemoglobin in the blood, but we use the dissolved oxygen as our way of measuring oxygenation. Oxygen is very poorly soluble in blood and water. The solubility coefficient for oxygen at body temperature is 0.225 mils per litre per kilopascal. Now, when you're doing a blood gas, the sample is put in a blood gas machine and the partial pressure of gas leaving that blood is measured. Of course, that partial pressure reflects Henry's law. So if the FiO2 is 0.21 or 21%, then the PaO2 is expected to be 13 kilopascals. I'll get back to that in a minute. 13 kilopascals multiplied by 0.225 equals 3 mils per 100 mils. And because the total blood volume is around 5 litres, then there is approximately 150 mils in total of oxygen dissolved in the blood, and that's not very much. Remember, most of the oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. Assuming that we're at sea level, we know that the atmospheric pressure is 100 kilopascals and the pressure within the alveoli is also 100 kilopascals, and Dalton's law must apply. That means the partial pressure of all of the gases that are in the alveoli must add up to 100 kilopascals. We know that when oxygen is delivered to the mouth, that the PiO2, that's the partial pressure of inspired oxygen, is 21 kilopascals at sea level. By the time it reaches the alveoli, it is now in a mixture of 4 gases. Water vapor and carbon dioxide join oxygen and nitrogen. Thus, nitrogen and oxygen are diluted down. The nitrogen is now 75% or 75 kPa. It is relatively in steady state with the blood, which means that there is no uptake or release of nitrogen. It just kind of stays the same. Oxygen is on average 13.5% of alveolar gas, or 13.5 kilopascals, and it does change a little bit because of oxygen uptake as you go along the capillary. The air is fully saturated within the alveoli with water vapor. That is always 6.2% or 6.2 kilopascals, and carbon dioxide is present in expired gas at just over 5% or 5.3 kilopascals. There is a small gradient between the alveolar and arterial blood for oxygen due to the bronchial circulation. So the P arterial O2, the P small AO2, is around 13 kilopascals. The PaCO2 equalizes with the alveolar CO2, which is 5.3 kilopascals, assuming that there isn't a lot of dead space available, for example, from too much PEEP, or else the patient isn't hypoventilating. So in steady state, on a patient who's on a ventilator or not on a ventilator, the arterial CO2 and the alveolar CO2 are the same. So I call this the PiO2 to PaO2 gradient. Essentially, if you're inspiring 21% oxygen, it's 21 kilopascals. The difference between that and the arterial oxygen is about 8 kilopascals or 60 millimeters of mercury. That is the least amount you can possibly have between the two. Even with perfectly normal healthy lungs, there was always at least an 8 kilopascal difference between the inspired oxygen and the arterial oxygen. The difference being made up of water vapor, carbon dioxide, and the bronchial circulation. So as that number spreads, the wider the spread between the two, the more likely that the patient has atelectasis or some form of lung disease. And likewise, we know because of all of this that carbon dioxide follows the same path, that if the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in arterial blood is 5.3 kilopascals, then the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli, assuming there isn't a lot of dead space due to too much PEEP or hypoventilation, is 5.3% in the alveoli, 5.3 kilopascals. That translates to an end-tidal CO2, that's CO2 in expired gas, that is 0.1 to 0.2% or 0.1 to 0.2 kilopascals lower than the alveolar CO2, which is the same as the arterial CO2. Just to summarize that, the normal PI to PaO2 gradient in kilopascals at sea level is 8, and it's made up of a small shunt The partial pressure of water vapor, 6.2 kilopascals, doesn't change, and the alveolar CO2, which is more or less the same as the arterial CO2, but slightly higher than the end tidal CO2. And from this, you can make a lot of assumptions. Two things that are really useful to know. The first one is that the partial pressure of inspired oxygen in kilopascals is for all intents and purposes the same as the FiO2 in percentage terms. For example, what is the PI, the partial pressure of inspired oxygen, if the FiO2 is 40%? So the PiO2 versus the FiO2, very simple now. If the FiO2 is 40%, the PiO2 is the atmospheric pressure, 100 kilopascals times 0.4, and that works out at 40 kilopascals, which is incidentally 300 millimeters of mercury. So that's really easy peasy, isn't it? The second thing is that the PaO2, the partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood, in kilopascals is a minimum of 8 kilopascals and a maximum of 12 kilopascals lower than the PiO2 in kPa. If it really is hovering at 10 kilopascals or more, you have a problem with ventilation mismatch or hypoventilation, increasing, for example, the amount of carbon dioxide in alveoli. So, what is the PaO2 in Kevin's case if the FiO2 is 40%? And we're assuming that Kevin is not hypoventilating and doesn't have a load of atelectasis. If the PiO2 is 40 kilopascals, the smallest possible difference between his PiO2 and his PaO2 is 8 kilopascals or 32 kilopascals. Post-operatively, due to hypoventilation, some atelectasis, etc., which may or may not be the case in Kevin's case, the PaO2 may be a little bit lower, between 28 and 30 kilopascals. Now, that is more than double what we would normally see in a blood gas on a patient who has nothing wrong with them. So why would you give this patient so much oxygen? Is there any value to this? Well, let's have a quick look at this. The formula for oxygen content of blood per 100 mils, remember this is per 100 mils, is the amount of oxygen that is attached to hemoglobin plus the dissolved oxygen. The formula for this is 1.34 times the hemoglobin multiplied by the saturation divided by 100, that's the percentage saturation, plus the PaO2, the partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood, times the solubility coefficient 0.225 in kilopascals. Let's have a quick look at the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. On the left-hand side, in the y-axis, is the percentage of hemoglobin saturated, and on the x-axis is the partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood. The oxygen content of hemoglobin is non-linear and follows this oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. If the patient's saturation is 100% with normal body temperature, then the PaO2 is around 13 kilopascals or 100 millimeters of mercury. Because of the non-linearity, we worry about this point here, the shoulder of the S-shaped curve. At this point, about 92% saturation, and that doesn't seem like much of a drop. The PaO2 is a marginal 8 kilopascals, which is pretty low for an individual with normal lungs. So we really like to see a saturation above this point. Conversely, in Kevin's situation, his PaO2 is 26 kilopascals or higher, so he cannot saturate above 100%. Clearly, as we will see later, if his saturation is 92% and 40% oxygen, there is a significant problem. But what is happening to all of this additional oxygen in the blood? Does it translate to an increase in the oxygen content? Or once we hit that 100% marker, is this just sticking there and the oxygen is of no value? So let's have a look at the oxygen content of blood if the FiO2 is 40% and the hemoglobin in Kevin's case is 15 grams per deciliter. So let's do the calculation. And I've just shown you this formula, which is 1.34 times the hemoglobin, 15 times 1 because he's 100% saturated, plus the partial pressure of oxygen times the solubility coefficient. And that works out at 18.6 plus 32 times 0.225. Remember, he's getting 40% oxygen. And that translates to 25.8 mils per 100 mils of blood, or 1.3 litres of oxygen in the bloodstream. And that's about 5 mils of oxygen per 100 mils higher in the bloodstream than inspiring air. Just out of interest, if we were giving Kevin 100% oxygen, and anesthesiologists routinely do this at the beginning of operations with the idea of washing out all the nitrogen from the blood, and ideally you will let the patient breathe 100% oxygen for a few minutes and everything equalizes out. Let's do the calculation. It's 18.6 because the amount of oxygen stuck to hemoglobin cannot be increased over 100%, plus 100 times 0.225, and that works out at 41 mils per 100 mils of blood, or 2 litres of oxygen in the bloodstream. The difference here is 18 mils per 100 mils of blood, or 900 mils in the bloodstream, and that's a significant difference, keeping in mind that oxygen, even though it is poorly soluble, dissolves in all of the extracellular fluid, not just in the blood. So the dissolved oxygen content of all extracellular fluid likely is 3 times higher. Helen is undergoing hyperbaric medical therapy. That's hyperbaric oxygen therapy, where she will receive 2.4 atmospheres of pressure with an inspired oxygen tension of 100%. What is Helen's PaO2 and her blood oxygen content? So Helen is receiving 100% oxygen and she has no lung injury. In the hyperbaric chamber, she's getting 2.4 atmospheres of pressure, which translates very simply to 240 kilopascals. Isn't that really easy? Or 1,824 millimeters of mercury, which is a random looking number. And so assuming that the gradient between her inspired oxygen tension and her blood is only 8 kilopascals, then she is getting 232 kilopascals of oxygen delivered into her bloodstream. The dissolved oxygen content will increase quite substantially, up to 54 mils per 100 mils of blood. Now remember, we have 18.6 already attached to hemoglobin, so that gives us a total oxygen content per 100 mils of blood of 72 mils, or 3.6 litres of oxygen in the 5 litre bloodstream. So that's a pretty impressive increase in the amount of oxygen compared with baseline. So don't underestimate the value of dissolved oxygen in blood. And that oxygen is also in the extracellular space. So there is actually much more oxygen present than these standard calculations make you believe. Now let's move on to another clinical scenario. You're in the operating room and you have a patient on the table known as Les. He's 48 years old. He's getting total IV anesthesia for an operation. He's on 30% oxygen that's being mixed with air, and he's mechanically ventilated, receiving a tidal volume of 6 mils per kilo, 450 mils by 12 breaths with no PEEP, and his end tidal CO2 is 5.1 kilopascals. He's hemodynamically stable and his oxyhemoglobin saturation on the pulse oximeter is 100%. Someone suggests to you that you might do a blood gas, but you say, no, I don't need to do a blood gas here because I can be pretty sure I know what the PaO2 and PaCO2 are. So we know that Les is on 30% oxygen, the saturation is 100%, and his end tidal is 5.1, and in steady state the end tidal CO2 is 0.1 to 0.2 kPa below the partial pressure of CO2. That means that his partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood is 5.2 or 5.3 kilopascals. Very small margin of error here. If the patient is receiving 30% oxygen, then the PiO2 is 30 kilopascals and the PaO2 is 30 minus 8 or 22 kilopascals, with a little bit of wiggle room, maybe 20 kilopascals. So pretty simple, right? And the question is, well, that's a long way, in Les's case, above the 13 kilopascals that we would normally have, and we don't even get excited unless the saturation is below 92%. That's 8 kilopascals. So that's nearly 3 times the amount of oxygen that you think the patient needs. So why do anesthesiologists give so much oxygen? Well, there were a lot of reasons for this. Firstly, on some anesthetic machines, if you use automatic end tidal control, you cannot give a fraction of inspired oxygen of less than 0.3. And that's because 30% was the magic number for many years for most anesthesiologists. And the reason for giving this extra oxygen was fear. anesthesiologists are afraid that the ventilator may disconnect from an endotracheal tube, that the patient may get laryngospasm, there may be an unexpected event such as coughing, or the patient biting on the endotracheal tube, or the patient may have a PE, or various other things, and they want to have some wiggle room with oxygenation so that if something happens, there is more oxygen on board than you need, so there's some reservoir. Fair enough. Also, patients who are under anesthesia usually get volatile anesthetics. These are gases, and they displace oxygen from the alveoli. When patients go to sleep, atelectasis occurs. There is a shift in the diaphragm and cephala direction, so there is often atelectasis in the posterior dorsal segments of the lungs, and the lung volumes are reduced below F4C. There's also, aside from the compression atelectasis, absorption atelectasis associated with all the oxygen we give. Most anesthesiologists do not believe that giving 30 to 40% oxygen hurts the patient, and there is no compelling evidence that it actually does so. And finally, there is some lingering belief out there that high intraoperative inspired oxygen tensions may reduce the risk of surgical site infections, but this is not supported by currently published evidence. So let's move on and look at another scenario that's quite common. You're in the ICU, and in the ICU is Tim, who was admitted with community-acquired pneumonia. He subsequently developed ARDS. Now, when somebody says this patient has ARDS, the first question that one usually asks is how hypoxic the patient is. How do we quantify hypoxemia in ARDS? And we do this by looking at the PaO2 FiO2 ratio. That is the oxygenation of arterial blood divided by the FiO2, that's in 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, etc. And you're informed that it is 26. And you think, wow, that's unbelievably low. But the patient is pink and the FiO2 is 0.5. And then you realize that the PF ratio is in kilopascals. So 26, is that good, bad, or in between? So now let's look at the PF ratio. This is a normal patient breathing 21% oxygen, and that's 0.21 goes into the patient, and their arterial oxygen tension is 100 millimeters of mercury, or 13 kilopascals. So what you do is you divide 13 by 0.21, and that gives you a number of 62 in kilopascals. If it was in millimeters of mercury, it would be 475, which is a big number. So normally the PaO2 is 13 kilopascals, the FiO2 is 21, and so the PF ratio for normal lungs is 62 in kilopascals. In my view, the best way to look at this is that the partial pressure of oxygen in blood is 62% of the inspired partial pressure. I'll get back to that in a minute. But if the FiO2 is 40%, the PF ratio in this case with 13 kilopascals in arterial blood would be 32.5. The lower the PaO2 divided by FiO2 in kilopascals or millimeters of mercury, the greater the oxygenation problem. This is the commonly used table for PF ratio, and the points where people get kind of excited are a PF ratio of 200. Below that level, if the patient has an inflammatory acute lung injury, we call that ARDS, and it's quite severe if the PF ratio is below 100. Now we can broaden this out, and we can look at the PaO2 in kilopascals, the FiO2 in percentage, the FiO2 in kilopascals, and the PF ratio in kilopascals. And you can see that someone who is breathing in room air, 21% oxygen, has a PaO2 of 13, and the PF ratio is 62. It can't get any higher than this, so the highest PF ratio to pKa is about 60%. Seen from this perspective, a falling PF ratio represents in percentage terms the degree of lung disease or shunting or gas displacement between the mouth and arterial blood. And those numbers can get really tiny. For example, at the bottom of the chart is a PaO2 of 7 kilopascals on 80% oxygen, and that represents only 8.75% of inspired oxygen tension. The equivalent PF ratio in millimeters of mercury is 66.25. In many ways, using the PaO2 divided by the PiO2 to generate a fractional number is quite handy, and it gives us a idea of how much oxygen is being lost proportionately as one develops profound hypoxemia. In this case, the normal ratio is 0.62 or 62% of oxygen that gets into the bloodstream. As the number falls, and I've rounded up some of the numbers in the orange column, you can see that that fraction drops. But if only 25% of inspired oxygen reaches the artery, it is the equivalent of a PF ratio of 200. If 12.5% reaches it, that is the equivalent of a PF ratio of 100. It also clarifies the situation. 10 to 12% of inspired oxygen is a much more powerful indicator of the severity of hypoxemia than, for example, 80 to 100. So I kind of like this approach, but I'm not selling it to you as a new way of doing things. It's just an alternative way. But what makes the PaO2, FiO2 or PaO2, PiO2 ratio quite neat in kilopascals because everything is so decimal. If you're living in the millimeters of mercury world, moderate hypoxemia is less than 300, moderate to severe less than 200, and severe hypoxemia is a PF ratio of less than 100. If you want to convert it to kilopascals, you divide by 7.6 or multiply the kilopascals by 7.6 to get the millimeters of mercury. And this is what you get: patient on 80% oxygen with a arterial oxygen tension of 100 millimeters of mercury or 13 kilopascals. The PF ratio here is 100 divided by 0.8 or 125 or 16 in kilopascals, or in other words, 16% of the inspired oxygen is actually getting to the alveoli. Now, Tim presents with hypoxemia. His FiO2 is 40%, the PaO2 is 10 kilopascals. What is his PF ratio in kilopascals and in millimeters of mercury? So Tim has a PaO2 of 10 on an FiO2 of 0.4. 10 divided by 0.4, and that equals a PF ratio in kilopascals of 25, or 0.25 if it's the PaO2 divided by the PiO2, or 25% of inspiratory oxygen. Now, to give that in millimeters of mercury, we're going to multiply by 7.6, and the PF ratio in millimeters of mercury is 190. Or alternatively, you can multiply 10 by 7.6 and divide by 0.4 to get the same one. Now let's review this tutorial. In this tutorial, we looked at kilopascals as a way of measuring oxygen tension, why there's a really easy correlation between the FiO2 in percentage terms and kPa in pressure terms. We looked at oxygen content of the blood using kilopascals versus millimeters of mercury, and why the PaO2 FiO2 ratio in kilopascals is actually quite useful. In the next tutorial, I will discuss kilopascals in acid-base calculations. Kilopascals in respiratory acid base, that's hypercarbia, hypocarbia, and kilopascals in metabolic acid base abnormalities, looking at compensation for metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. Join me then, and I guarantee you'll learn something. Well, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please click like now, hit subscribe, and introduce me to some of your friends and colleagues so I can grow the subscription base. Follow me also at ccmtutorials.org.